Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Professor Chris Kajak-Krajacek, and I'll be talking to you today about co-analysis and wargaming. So a little different take on wargaming than I think most of the conference, although I haven't heard today's presentations. I've been in class. So who am I? I'm a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel. You can see some pictures and stuff that I did back in my days in uniform. I was a pilot once, did some piloting stuff. I did some staff stuff, a couple of combat deployments. And kind of the big one that relates to what we're talking about here is I went to School of Advanced Warfighting. I got this Master's of Operational Studies and kind of became a planner after that. I spent 3 years at 3MEF working operational plans, and then another year at MCI Pacific, actually working some plans, which is a bit unusual for that command as an installations command, but they had some unique requirements out there in the Pacific that we actually need to write kind of a con plan caliber plan for that. So all that's my background in uniform. Since I retired back in 2016, I've been teaching at the Maritime Staff Operators course here at the Naval War College. And I'm the planning and preparation line of effort coordinator, which covers what we're going to talk about today, which is co-analysis and COA Wargaming. So this presentation is not a Navy War College presentation, although I stole a couple slides that I used in the class. This is all stuff I pulled together specifically for this talk because I don't want to be teaching the details of the steps of the process and more kind of generalist about how we do things, why we do them, and kind of how everything's laid out the way that it is, and how the war game itself feeds back into the rest of the planning in a little bit more of a general sense. So, why do we do wargaming? And I always tell the students, I both love and hate this quote from Admiral Nimitz. And I'll let you read it. You don't need me to read it to you, but I like it because it talks about the value of wargaming and identifying what the adversary might be doing and be able to see things that you may not have otherwise seen. What I don't like about it is it wasn't COA Wargaming. It was a different type of war game. They're doing kind of campaign analysis and working through a variety of different scenarios and a variety of different kind of enemies, environments, which is not what we do in the COA Wargaming process. So it's a good quote, but it doesn't quite capture what we want to talk about. So, but what are we going to talk about today? So I've got the purpose of wargaming. We're going to talk a little bit about this and why we do COA Wargaming and why it's important in the planning process and kind of what the wargame itself does for planners. And I got a couple of C stories I'll throw there. I have to truncate them a little bit to keep with our classification, but I got a couple of stories we can discuss. The other one is the general process. And this is a generalized process, although if you look at the pubs, they're all very similar. They're not identical. And I don't want to get into the gory details of differences between the JPP and the NWP and MDMP. Let's just stick with the generalities and things they all have in common. Then we'll talk a little about output and feedback and kind of what comes out of this, how it feeds back into the loop. And then we'll talk some pitfalls in conducting the war game, pretty much all of which I've experienced either out in my time as a planner or here as a professor teaching this as part of our curriculum. For those of you following at home, I do have our primary sources here are the JP5 TAC 0, the 2020 version, which is fairly new, December last year, and a lot of the NWP 5 TAC 01, which is an older pub, 2013. It's currently in rewrite, and we're expecting it to be signed any week now. Keep hearing that it's about ready to be signed. Both these pubs are full and classified. Neither one of them are FOUO. And I'll be quoting from them a little bit, not extensively, because this isn't a doctrine session. It's more about kind of the general things that they have in common. Okay, so quick overview of planning and how all this fits into it. So I teach over here Navy planning process, what I've been doing for the last 5 years. When I was in uniform, I did a whole lot of this, Marine Corps planning process. And a lot of this back when it used to be called the JOP, the Joint Operations Planning Process, and they've dropped the O. If you're familiar with what's been going on with that pub, you'll understand why. A little bit of interaction with Job for Air, a little bit with MDMP, but primarily Navy, Marine Corps, and Joint. What I really want to show you on this slide is that the processes are all very similar. There are important differences between them, but generally speaking, they all kind of follow the same flow. I've got some type of receiving of the mission, something that initiates my planning, and then some type of analysis on what my problem set is. So we go through a deliberate process to determine, hey, what's the problem? What's my command responsible for? What does my higher headquarters expect of me? What am I dealing with? Then we go into some type of course of action development. And again, they vary slightly by planning process, but they're all kind of similar. We go in and come up with solutions, options that can resolve whatever the problem is that we identified back in the earlier steps. And how many options you come up with and the details of those vary depending on the situations. Sometimes you just come up with one, and I've done that. Sometimes you're going to come up with 2, 3, 4. I think we had one. Most I've ever done was 7. That was kind of a unique problem set. We were able to generate a lot of potential options for the commander. If you get to too many options, like 7, you're probably not giving the commander what he or she wants. They're looking for a smaller set of available options. So there's some thought that needs to go into the right number. Once you've come up with some potential solutions, we come to this step, and you can see it's got a couple different names, although they all tend to have wargaming in it and co-analysis in it. But we're going to test those solutions. So we're going to work our way through and test, hey, what do we come up with, and does it hold up under some scrutiny? I mean, once we've done that testing, then we go into the comparison decision. Approval may or may not be part of the same step. In some cases, it's separate. We're going to choose which of those courses of actions are the best. And then we're going to go and develop our directives. And again, a couple different names for it, plan, orders, development, and then we're going to transition this thing for execution. Interestingly, both the JPP and the Job for Air don't have transition as part of the process. As a planner and somebody teaches this, I find that interesting, but it's not real big deal. So we're going to focus here on this step: co-analysis wargaming, or COA wargame, or whatever terminology you want to use. I understand that the term wargaming from my time in the wargame department has a little bit of controversy. I'm going to be using this phrasing because that's what the end of PP calls it, and that's what I'm comfortable using because it's what I teach predominantly. So you'll see me using the one word, no hyphens, and no double words. So my boss likes to tell a story. He was out. I don't remember which fleet, but the colonel who was getting ready to conduct the planning, or the captain, excuse me, who's getting ready to conduct the planning, made the comment that they're going to be using all 5 steps of the planning process, and several times made the reference to 5 steps of the planning process. So my boss, who was there as an observer, raised his hand and said, "Hey, last time I checked, there's 6 steps in the Navy planning process. Which one are we skipping?" And the guy's response was, nobody ever does wargaming. We're just going to skip that. Which then engendered a discussion about, is that really a good idea? And it's not a good idea to skip wargaming. Unfortunately, a lot of planners do. I think because they think it's a dark art or something esoteric about it. It's really hard, and you need special equipment and specially trained people, and you got to go to Newport, and none of that's true. You can do wargaming with any group of people who are reasonably intelligent, which is basically the entire officer corps falls in that category, who can just step through and analyze our course of action and determine if we need things, or if we have anything that we can improve. So we're talking a little about this step of the process and what it means and how we execute it and what we get out of it. So when you hear people talk about wargaming in the context of planning, you have a good idea of what they're talking about. Okay, so you'll see on this slide, I underline analysis and I debolded wargaming. And one of the reasons I do that is this step really is about the analysis part and less about the war game. The war game is just a method to conduct the analysis. It's a very good method, and it does get a lot out of it. But it's not about conducting the game. It's about analyzing the courses of action and trying to find issues and problems with them. So you see some definitions here right out of our pubs. Co-analysis process of closely examining those courses of action to reveal details that allow the commander staff to tend to identify ones that are valid and ones that are not, and to identify some advantages and disadvantages. The game itself is a representation of conflict or competition in a synthetic environment, which people make decisions and respond to the consequences of those decisions. And really, during COA development, we asked ourselves this question: hey, is the COA feasible and acceptable? And the COA wargame is another opportunity to look at that and have kind of this discussion. Can we actually do what we said to do, and are the results that we're going to get the results that we want? Is something going to happen that we don't really expect? And so that's what the war game is partly trying to help us with. All right, what else does it do for us? So you can see some pictures here from the War College. I think this is actually, I don't know what year that was, but obviously an older photo, a little bit more recent one, some of the game decks that are famous in Navy lore. So, okay, what are we getting out of this? Why am I doing this step? Well, it's going to help us synchronize forces and functions in time, space, and purpose. Years ago, back in 2012, I was the lead planner on a numbered O plan. It was the land component portion of the numbered O plan. So it was a ground support to the actual O plan. But it was a major planning effort that we were undertaking. I had about 170, 180 people came to our OPT. Worked through it for almost 3 full weeks. We had people there about 2.5 weeks of really hard, dedicated planning to work through this. We get to the war game, and we execute turn 1 of the war game. I'll talk more about that here in a minute. And we're met with catastrophic failure. That the person playing the red cell gave a good response, and we'll talk more about the red cell here in a few slides. He did what he was supposed to do. He later apologized to me about it. But he had nothing to apologize for. He did exactly what he was supposed to do, and we were met with catastrophic failure. And so, what do you do at that point? Well, you tell everybody to take 10-minute break, and we got the core of the planning team together and talked about it. What was the problem? Why did this fail so spectacularly so quickly? And what we found is the issue turned out to be a time issue. That really was our forces weren't properly synchronized in time. We had to go back and relook at how we had timelined the events out. And once we reworked that, things were successful. We were able to get what we needed out of the war game. So again, the war game helps you uncover these things. It's not something we uncovered in our regular planning because we specifically looked at that issue. But the war game helped us uncover it and therefore fix it. Okay, consequences of planned actions. That's a good one it's really hard when you're doing the hard planning and you're in there really worried about things like making sure the tasks are set up correctly, making sure their forces are properly organized, have the capabilities that they need. It's very easy to forget that some of those tasks that you've written are going to have consequences a little bit beyond the direct effect you're trying to generate. The war game can help with that. Help you determine that as you take these tasks, they may cause an effect in the battle space that's slightly different than what you had anticipated. And I'll talk about some of those and some of the people who help you with that here in a couple slides. All right, difficulties and coordination problems. So again, as you work through the war game, you start to really identify, hey, these are things that we just didn't properly work out. I'm really unclear on who may be responsible for a given task or who's responsible for coordinating a given set of actions. We'll often kind of wave our hands at things like logistics issues, or in the Navy, we'll often wave our hands at some ASW problems. We'll figure out that anti-submarine warfare issue in execution. We know how to do it. And then you start extending that over 1,000 nautical miles of battle space, and suddenly that problem becomes a bigger issue than you originally identified. Then, hey, maybe we need to go back and look at how are we coordinating all these assets who are performing that. Maybe there's a little bit more than we need to do. So again, the war game can help you identify those things as you start realizing, man, this isn't working the way we thought it would. Maybe we need to go back and take a look at some of these issues. All right, unanticipated decisions and contingencies. Things that will come up during the game, you realize, wow, we hadn't expected to have to make a decision on this issue, and now we do. So identifying those decision points are important. And if you look at the Navy doctrine, the decision support matrix, which catalogs all those decision points, is an output of this step of the process. I don't think that's true for every version of the planning process. It kind of moves around a little bit as to when it's meant to be done, but it's certainly meant to be done as part of this step in the Navy process. Because you do uncover a bunch of decisions that maybe we didn't realize we needed. And contingencies. All of a sudden you start to realize, wow, the adversary can do some things that take us outside of our plan. Our plan's kind of bounded for a certain set of actions, and all of a sudden the adversary can do some things or may choose to do some things that take us out of that. We need to make major changes. Maybe we need a branch plan or some other type of response we need to gen up. So again, something else we might uncover here. And then where and when to apply capabilities. So we go into the war game with a plan. We develop the course of action. We We got a pretty good idea of how and where we want to apply our capabilities, but we may determine that that's not the best way to do it. We need to go back and take another look at how do we go about doing, determining where those capabilities need to be. Okay, so as we go into this step, right, I've completed COA development. If you remember a couple of slides ago, this is generally the third or fourth step, depending on how you break out that planning initiation of the planning process. And we've just completed COA development, or at least in the flow of the planning. If you're an O-plan planner like I was, this could have been 3 months ago that we completed COA development. If you're in a crisis environment, it may have been less than an hour ago. It just depends on how much time you have allotted. But what's important to understand is that those outputs from COA development feed our wargaming, feed this step. So we have these things like our refined commander's intent. So we got an initial one from the commander. We worked with the commander, refined that. So now we have this going in to kind of guide what we're doing in COA analysis. I've gotten wargame guidance from the commander, hopefully. Not all commanders are well-versed in how to provide that guidance. Generally, if you don't know, or if your commander, if you don't know if your commander is comfortable with this, tell them what you want them to tell you. Say, hey, boss, here's what we think we should do in the war game. Let the commander give you guidance that way. It tends to be very effective with senior leaders. That if you give them a blank sheet to work with, they tend to not have time to really organize their thoughts because they're busy people. But if you give them something to start with, they tend to provide really good insight and really good guidance. So maybe I want to tell them what I want. Hey, and things you got to answer. Hey, which friendly COA and which enemy COA are we going to look at? Doctrine says all of them. If I have 2 enemy COAs, the most likely and most dangerous, and I have 6 friendly COAs, then I'm doing a bunch of war games because each friendly's got to be war gamed against each enemy. More commonly, I probably have 2 to 3 friendly and 2 enemies, so I'm looking 4 to 6 war games we have to execute. Might not be feasible to do all those, so maybe we need to have that discussion with the boss. Hey, do I need to do both enemy courses of action? Can I just do one? Does it depend on what I'm actually looking at? Where do those vary from each other? A lot you can discuss. We're going to talk about wargaming methods. Okay, what is the appropriate method to use? And we'll talk about that, but that's something the commander may give you. They may have some insight into which method they want you to approach. We'll talk about what that means here in a slide or so. And how much time do I have? Because, again, if I'm in a crisis, I may not have a whole lot of time to conduct this war game. But you need to do it. If I have an hour to conduct a war game, I'm going to do the war game. It's going to scale it back. I'm going to do something maybe a little different, but we're going to do it. If you give me a week to do a war game, I'll give you a more detailed war game with a whole lot going into it and coming out of it. But it really depends on what you got available to you and how much time to have available. And that's something that the commander usually can give you a little insight on. I need an approved COA. And that's not a selected COA. So when he says approved, don't think selected, a chosen COA, because we're not there yet. All right. What I need is I need a COA that's been approved by the commander to go into wargaming. So I know what I can wargame against. I need those updated enemy courses of action because sometimes this situation is dynamic and these courses of action are changing. And we'll talk about the red cell in a slide or so, but they may be giving me these updated courses of action, or I may have what was initially provided me from my intel community, but we need those updates. I need to know what my evaluation criteria, my critical events are. What am I actually going to look at? And we'll talk in a slide here how we go about determining those things. But what are these things that are important to me and important to the commander? And then those initial staff estimates. I can't stress how important staff estimates are. That's a whole other class. I'm not going to go into a lot here. Just they're important. We need to understand what each of those staff sections can and cannot do so that can be played appropriately in the war game. And then updated IPOE, right? Especially if having a dynamic situation that's changing, I need to know what's going on. I need that N2 rep to be able to come in and say, here's the latest, here's what's changed since the last time we talked. So we're constantly using that most recent information. Okay, so I have all those outputs now from COA analysis or from COA development, which are my inputs to COA Wargaming, COA analysis. So I can start organizing my my team. And you can see we got a whole bunch of cells here. I got my team lead, who's just responsible for making sure everything gets done and organizing. And I want reps from all of my op functions. So somebody from Intel, somebody can talk move, maneuver, fire, sustainment, command control, and protection, and information if I'm in the joint world. I need somebody who's looking at the information. Normally we tell our students to make sure there's somebody in your OPT who's looking at the problem from those lenses. Even better is if I get an actual SME from my command in those areas. So if I want somebody to look at fires, it's someone from the fire cell who actually understands fires and can provide that good insight for me. Likewise, for intel or protection, I have those appropriate people. Maybe I need some special staff reps. Legal is a good one to have hanging around as things start to go in the war game, to be able to provide some of that input from the legal side. PAO is another good one, especially if you're at a higher level command, your CIFMIC, your JTF command. Yeah, having PAO around is probably a good idea to be able to talk through what are some of the PAO issues that we've uncovered. And it's great if you can have those major subordinate commands, whoever they might be, have reps from them in there as well, especially if you're at that operational level and maybe you're a little unclear on exactly what your subordinates can do for you. If I'm not exactly sure what that mu-arg can do, it's nice that they're in the room to answer that question. Hey, how many forces do we actually need to do this raid on this island or seize this airfield? It's good if you have experts there, the people who will actually go and do those missions, be able to provide some insight to you. And what's nice, if you have those representatives in there, they can look at the war game from the lens of their command and be asking themselves, do I have all the right tasks? Do I have the right forces? Have I been tasked to do something that I'm incapable of executing because I don't have the right forces? You also need somebody to scribe who's going to be capturing this information. I'll show an example of a worksheet here in a minute just to see kind of how we're going to capture that. All right. Do you need a white cell? And it depends on what you call the white cell. Usually the white cell isn't what you think of a normal war game with a bunch of adjudicators determining whether or not things have been successful. It's usually more the people who are capturing information, making sure all the PowerPoints and whatever technology you're using is working properly, and the OPT lead and deputy are keeping everything on time. It's usually all you really need for a white cell or for COA Wargaming as opposed to other types. All right, this thing called a green cell. I don't know if it ever really got formalized in doctor, but we used it quite a bit when I was out at the MEF. And this is someone, and we'll talk more about it here in a slide or two, but they kind of tend to play the neutral players who may be involved. And then the red cell we'll talk about here in a slide, and they're the ones who are going to play that adversary for you. Key is, hey, this changes depending on the composition size of this effort changes dramatically depending on time available, budget available, who can I bring in, who can I not bring in. Again, we ran a huge war game where we flew people in to play parts of the war game for our co-analysis step. Maybe you can't do that. So maybe I just have people who are from within my command playing out these roles. But get the best people that you can get in to help you out, come up with a good product. So let's talk about red cell. I think red cell is one of the more misunderstood components of this war game effort. I mean, their job is to accurately portray the adversary, whoever that might be. So you need some people from most likely your intel community who understand the adversary and how they operate. But it's not just the intel community, which is, I think, a common misconception that this is just something our two shops do for us. Oh, they should help and be involved, but you really need some operators in there. And maybe other people as well. Maybe I need some logisticians. Maybe I need some communicators in there. Maybe you need some other subject matter experts who have that good understanding of cultural backgrounds and geographies and hydrographies and all those things that may affect what's going on. Because you really want some mix of intel, operators, and any other subject matter experts that you need to bring into this environment. Which means you probably need some augmentation from outside your command if you can get it. So if I can get the budget to fly people in, I'd love to. We had people from the Halsey team come out to support our wargaming efforts. We had people from a couple PhDs that would come out and support our COA Wargaming. It's great when you can do that, but you can't always. And sometimes you have to make do with who you have. Okay. The other thing I think is commonly misunderstood with the red cell, one is people think it's only in the intelligence community, but the other one is that the red cell's job is not to defeat the friendly course of action, but it's to help identify weaknesses so that we can improve it. I've been at war games where the red cell has gone way off the rails, and they've just almost tried to make a point of showing, how dangerous the enemy could be, or the enemy might do things we didn't expect, and it completely kind of throws the whole effort in a loop, because now I have someone who's not accurately playing the adversary, and they're doing things that are a bit sketchy to defeat our course of action because they know what it is, and not accurately portraying realistic moves from the adversary to help us close some of those holes. So you got to watch out for that. I need a red cell who understands their role is not to defeat the friendly course of action, but to improve it. So what I want the red cell to actually do for me? Well, they need to be consistent with enemy objectives. And here's where we'll often see, especially with some of our bigger threat actors that we try to wargame against, people running off the rails because they'll take actions not in line with the enemy objectives that we've identified for the planning effort. They'll kind of determine what they think those objectives should be, and it kind of really runs things inappropriately. They got to use enemy capabilities and enemy center of gravity. So what I don't need is a red cell who's going to kind of come up with their own capabilities lists or use capabilities that in a way that they're not normally employed. So kind of reaching outside the normal bounds of what we expect how we expect the operation to unfold. I mean, it's good if I'm fighting an insurgent force, they'll do all kinds of crazy things. But if I'm dealing with a kind of a known entity in a threat nation military that we know operates under a certain method and follow kind of certain doctrines, we would expect their moves to be consistent with those. Right. They need to take blue action into account. We'll talk about this in a slide or so, but the red action is a reaction to blue. So we got to make sure that they are approaching that appropriately. And we want to focus on the friendly critical vulnerabilities and really poke at those things that are most damaging to the friendly force. So we can identify those places that need immediate attention because the adversary could potentially cause big problems. And they should be forcing us to change our COA, not rewrite it, but make tweaks to it to make it better. If my red cell actions aren't actually driving me to make changes, then they're not being effective and they're not being helpful. Okay, so the green cell. Well, again, I'm not convinced this has fully made it widely into doctrine, but like I said, we've used it a lot. And they're the ones, they're playing those neutral, unaligned factions that are out there. I'm trying to accurately portray them as best as we can. So if you're operating like we did on our major numbered O plan, and I have like 20 some odd countries out there, maybe I need someone thinking about each of those countries because they all could potentially weigh in on that conflict. And what do we think they may or may not be willing to accept? Similarly, just like with the red cell, it's not just intel folks. I may need some operators out there, depending on who I'm talking about. I may need some SMEs. Hey, maybe I need some diplomats or State Department reps or people who have worked in those environments to understand kind of the political ideas that some of these nations have. Probably need augmentation. All right. What's the green cell trying to do? It's trying to identify those things that could cause these neutral actors to act in response to the operation. Ideally, if we've identified them as neutral, unaligned actors, we usually want to keep them that way. Maybe there's sometimes we want to do some other things with them, but in which case we probably address them differently. But generally, we're trying to make sure that what we're doing isn't going to tip a neutral or unaligned actor to come in on the side of the adversary. So we have to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with what they want to see. It can also help with things like CMO, HADR, stability operations. It can help with those things as well. Have a better understanding of how the actions we take may affect those civilian populations. It may lead us to maybe look at those pieces a little bit differently. And then it helps shape our expectations. Better idea of how our actions may intentionally or unintentionally have impact on those other nations out there. Okay. So I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we need to do is decide that type of a game that we're gonna war game, and what method we're gonna use. So the joint pub talks about computer aided versus manual, but if you actually read those sections, they're not that different, other than one uses a computer to help display information and the other one doesn't. They're not substantially different in conduct. It's just the tools that you're using to display and capture information. And then we determine what method are we going to use to conduct the game. So, and there's a variety of them. These are some that I see pop up a lot. You can do a timeline analysis where I look at each day or group of days discretely and say, we're going to war game, day one, now go to war game day two, and look at everything that happens in that day. We may look at the operational phasing. I'm looking at each phase individually. Okay, we're going to wargame all of phase 1, then all of phase 2, and look at those significant actions phased out in time. Maybe, and this is a common one from my experience, is to do the sequence of essential tasks. That's where I look at a series of critical events and we're going to wargame them in sequence. So what happens around this critical event? What happens around the next critical event? What happens around the next critical event? I could choose to do a box. All right. So again, if I have a something like in a amphibious objective area or some other confined piece of geography that I really want to focus on what's going to go on inside that piece of geography, I could choose to use a box, and we're going to look at all those actions that take place inside that piece of ground or sea. I could do a belt, which is kind of like a box, except I have a sequence of them. I'm looking at each one of these sequences in time and space independently as we work through kind of each piece. Or I can do this thing called amplitude and depth. And here's where I've got, a bunch of approaches, and we're looking at each one individually because they're not mutually supporting. Each one becomes kind of its own individual action. So we're going to look at them that way. All this really helps you do is determine what am I actually going to look at when I do this war game, because I can't look at everything. So I want to focus everybody down to those things that are most important. But regardless of what I choose, whether I go manual or computer aided or which one of these methods I choose, they're all going to follow the same procedure. I'm going to have a blue action followed by a red reaction followed by a blue counteraction. And I know at least the JP and the NWP say this. I know the Marine Corps pub used to. I'm pretty confident that both the Army and the Air Force pubs say this as well, but I haven't checked them recently. But that's the process we're going to use. Blue gets 2 moves, red only gets 1. We'll talk more about that here in a slide or so. As we're doing this, we got this selected or expanded wargame worksheet. So one of the things you got to decide to do is, hey, how am I going to display my results? How am I going to capture them? This is, you'll see versions of this in a variety of doctrine. I got a phase. I have some kind of component function. Here's the things they're going to be doing, tasks and purposes. Here's what the red cell did as a response, and here's what we did as a counteraction, and remarks that we may need to make as well. All of this is a way to capture what we did in the game. And so you'll make determination of how do I want to capture that. This is a good method. There's some other worksheets you may see out there a little bit different. What's important is when you're capturing this, it's got to have enough rigor to become that base of my sync matrix. So there needs to be detail in there. It's got to be structured and rigorous so we can get the right information captured. We're also going to be looking to capture things like branches and sequels. I may have changes to my commander's critical information requirements. So maybe new information I want to go collect. And then, hey, I can also add in other people if I need to. Maybe I want to look at higher headquarters is doing, or local populace, or have a risk column where I can talk about risk issues associated with what's going on. And depending on where in the world you are, some of those risk calculations may go outside of your operation. I know certain theaters were worried about some strategic risk every time we conduct a military operation because the other nations in the area that may get pulled into it. Okay, so now we're going to prepare for this war game and conduct it. So yeah, I want to do roll call, got it. We want to make sure everybody understands why we're here. Hey, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the process? What are the expected results? I go through the rules and the guidance, and then go through and review all that information we talked about earlier. All right, and then we're going to take through a walk through a turn. So I got my graphic, and this is an old scenario we used to use here in my course. That's where that graphic came from. I've got my facilitator, I got my red cell, maybe I got a green cell, got all my control measures, maps, icons, named areas of interest, anything else I need. I got my MSCs, I got my reps from the staff sections. We're all ready to go. So friendly takes a turn. All right, they bust out their draft sync matrix, and they walk through their turn, their friendly actions. Here's what we're going to do relative to whatever we've decided to war game. So it's a box or a critical event or whatever there might be, we're going to look at that. Forces, functions, decisions by the commander, all those things associated with that, we're going to talk through them with the red cell. Here's what we're doing. All right, red cell's then going to take that and go back, and they're going to come back with that reaction. And maybe you'll get a green cell reaction if you're using a green cell. But they're going to do the same thing. If you do these things, then this is how we're going to respond. So going back to my old scenario here that we used to use, we'd often have students doing shows of force in various places around the region. Again, this is an older version of what we teach now. Okay, if I drop a show of force out here in vicinity of Sunday Strait, and my adversary has a bunch of forces here, maybe I'll get some. Maybe we'll get a reaction that we don't want out here in this major shipping lane. So we may have to make a determination on, hey, was that the right thing to do? But we'll get an idea from the enemy reaction of what we think the enemy might do in response to what we're doing. Maybe they'll sortie ships, sortie aircraft. Maybe they'll turtle in, whatever they might do. And the blue cell, the planning team sits back and says, okay, if that's what the enemy's going to do, what are we going to do about that? And this is another place of common misconception when it comes to friendly counteractions. The counteraction isn't necessarily the next action in time. I did A, enemy did B, and I'm going to do C, and they all kind of go in order in time. The friendly counteraction could be to rework part of my plan. Hey, I need to reassign assets because I didn't put enough forces in this area. Or I need to rework my command and control because a force is not able to get what it needs. Maybe I have the wrong tasks. I can go back and retask those assets. So part of that friendly counteraction can be essentially redoing the whole turn. Here's what we're going to do differently if the enemy were to take those actions. And the reason we do that is because we're trying to improve our course of action. We're not trying to one-up each other and beat the other one at the war game. We're trying to come up with a better course of action to improve our chances for success in the real world. All right, after that, then I go make my adjustments. Okay, this is what we thought the counteraction was. What do I actually need to change in my course of action? Maybe I need to change my task organization, my control measures, maybe my ROE, wherever the case might be that I need to change. And then we get ready for the next turn. And we do it all again until we work through all the turns that we've determined that we need to execute. Okay, so primary results, right? Again, the results of this war game and any additional analysis we do should lead to improvement in the COA. I need a better COA at the end than I started with. That's what we're trying to accomplish here. All right, so any of those identified problems need to be addressed. So if we identified issues in our COA, we need to address them before we move on. And here you can just see a nice graphic I pulled out of this is out of the draft version, the NWP 5.01, that should be out anytime now. I've got we got all these things we talked about: commander's guidance, friendly course of action, enemy's course of action, all kind of coming into the war game, and then all these potential things that will come out of it. That all these things go into our planning. Okay, so what comes out of this? And again, these are fairly generic. Some of these outputs may be specific. You may or may not see this exact list. What I want to see is that refined course of action, right? I need a refined course of action because that's why I did this. Something that's better than what I had initially. Okay, I need that wargame record that's going to show me what we did so we can actually capture why we made the changes that we made. That list of critical events is all covered in there, and those decision points, which will ultimately go into my decision support template, decision support matrix. If I identify any of those sequels that are identified for development, again, they're going to be identified here in that wargame worksheet. Updated facts and assumptions. Maybe we determine that our assumptions are wrong or old. We need to go ahead and update them. Maybe some of those have been turned into facts. Maybe the facts have changed. We need to make sure I identify all those. I've got a refined task organization, and I got these updated evaluation criteria. All right, the boss said there are certain things that he or she was concerned with, and now we've gone through the war game. Maybe we make some changes to these, add a couple, maybe tweak a few before we go into comparison decision and start comparing these things. Okay, I got a couple questions coming through on chat. If you want to throw those on the banner, I'll hit them one top to bottom. I see 2 on there right now. But until these pop up on the banner, I'm going to keep talking. There we go. How much capacity for surprise by the red cells tolerable? Quite a bit. We don't pretend to know everything the adversary might do. So we're certainly open to surprise. And there are some things that will come out that do surprise us. They just need to be realistic and within the bounds of what we think the adversary's objectives are. So, again, if the red cell is trying to show that they're smarter than the OPT, which sometimes happens, I'm going to show you how smart I am. I'm going to do something that's way outside of what we've been told to plan against. That's a problem because it's not improving our COA. It's going back to our assumptions and the kind of the foundations of our planning. But if the red cell is just saying, hey, if you guys would take these actions, here's some realistic things that adversary could do that we're not prepared for, that's good because it forces us to then determine how do we want to prepare for that. I'll give an example. Go back here to one of these little graphics. I'll give a little bit of an example of what we've seen with the students. So often they'll have a regional air defense command out here, and the adversary will decide they're going to launch a bunch of air assaults up into this area. And we'll ask them, well, you've already assigned these people to defend the airspace. So is there anything you need to do? And it's often, no, not really. But we will see some things to do that are a surprise is, hey, maybe they're going to sortie a whole bunch of commercial ships out in this area to clog the sea lanes and slow down the movement of friendly vessels. That's something that we really hadn't planned for, but it's realistic. Enemy has all these flagships they can throw out there in harm's way, so it can cause some problems. So there are things like that that are surprises that are valuable. Or maybe they're going to mine someplace we didn't expect them to mine. Maybe they're going to reallocate forces and move things around. So I certainly think as long as we're within the objectives and generally within that enemy course of action, surprise is certainly allowed. I hope that answered your question. And whenever you throw the next one up for me, I'm going to get back to where I was in the brief. Okay, what is the role of variability of outcomes in COA analysis? So we don't really predict. I mean, I understand what you're talking about, and I don't know that we really do that during, at least at our level of operations planning, get into kind of the ORSA statistics and statistical predictions. Because we're not looking at the outcome of the war game as in who won, who lost, and I'm not expecting to look at how many people would I think are going to get injured and what's my force attrition versus enemy's force attrition. What we're really looking at is what are things the adversary can do that we hadn't accounted for? Are there capabilities the adversary can bring to bear in a way that we hadn't planned for that could cause us real problems? If I run into a place where we're like, wow, here's an engagement that we're not confident we could win, that's a problem in the course of action then, because I don't want to be putting my forces in positions where they may not be able to be successful. So maybe we need to go back and look at reallocation assets or providing different capabilities. So I hope I got to that question, what you meant by that question. If not, you can kind of reattack it. Okay, I'm going to move on to pitfalls. As more questions come up, just throw them up there and I'll get to them. So pitfalls, there's always pathologies in planning. There's pitfalls, what we can come up with. So during the war game, there's some things that we see consistently. And one is just not doing it. People just skip it entirely. And I don't know why. I think it's, again, people think this is harder than it is. This requires specific knowledge, and I need subject matter experts in here, and I need people to crunch a bunch of numbers. And you don't. I mean, any war game is better than none. We did planning for Marine Forces Japan years ago, and didn't really have a lot of time to go through and work a detailed war game for this specific planning effort. So we just basically did what you would look like a rock drill, recursal concept drill. We all sat around the table and just talked through in detail how we saw this particular operation unfolding and came up with a whole bunch of problems that we were able to resolve. And that was a simple war game of just a group of people sitting around a table talking, but talking with purpose and with structure of that conversation. Here's what is going to happen first, and this allotted period of time, and walk through. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'm doing. And then determining whether or not all that worked. Did what we say actually line up the way we had meant for it to? So, again, skipping the war game is always a problem. You got to make sure you do it. I've seen a lot of comments come through. One comment specifically about adjudication. Hey, so a couple of years ago, a lot of years ago now, 2011, I think, my boss sent me away to figure out how to do this war game for my O plan. And I came here to the War College and talked to a couple of the professors about adjudicating war games. And that's where we started the conversation. And they threw way too much stuff at me to be able to talk about how to properly adjudicate. And then I let slip that I'm talking about COA Wargaming. And they both went, oh, COA Wargaming, that's completely different. You don't need to adjudicate at all. Well, hold on. What do you mean I don't have to adjudicate at all? And I talk through that you don't really need to, because that's not the point. The point isn't to determine how much attrition I get objectively, or how or who wins what engagements. You're not really adjudicating a move. You're determining how can actions potentially affect my planning. So if I take an action that results in that we have a disagreement about how it might be resolved, that's a problem with my plan. I need to go back to the COA and fix it. If we can't determine, more or less how it's going to play out, if future portions of my planning are contingent on, for example, a certain amount of attrition of the adversary, that's a planning problem. I need to go back into my planning and write into it the condition that this attrition needs to take place so that we can progress the plan. So if I need in phase 3, I need to have a certain amount of CDCMs and SAM sites destroyed, that's a condition I write into my planning. I don't go in and say, roll a bunch of dice and determine if we think we would have got it. I write the condition to say I'm not going to phase 3 until these assets are no longer functioning. And then during phase 2, we sort out how we're going to execute that. So the adjudication piece in COA wargaming, as opposed to other types of wargaming, really isn't as important because it's not about adjudicating the move. It's about uncovering problems that the course of action hasn't accounted for. And I can't keep up with the comments. I just saw the adjudication one. So as you put banners up, I'll try to address them. Back to some other pitfalls. A lack of preparation is always a problem. Ops wargamers think a single action reaction counter cycle is different. So in COA wargaming, that's one turn. Action, reaction, counteraction is one turn. So that's just turn one, and that's just turn one, right? So I may have multiple turns, and I may have multiple turns per critical event. If I'm doing a box, maybe I have multiple turns in each box. So yeah, but one turn, action, reaction, counteraction. Do ops wargamers think a single is sufficient? Oh, I misread your question. Do they think it's sufficient? Depends. And again, this is up to the planners to determine how many turns they think they need. Here in the class, we usually just do one. That's time consideration issue. It really depends on what you're trying to uncover. And in some cases, maybe I don't get enough reaction on my first turn. I need to do another one to really get the red cell to start reacting to what I'm doing. So there's a big it depends there. And yeah, it just sometimes one's enough. Sometimes you got to do more than one. Ideally, you would know that going in. The big war game I had with catastrophic failure, we planned on 3 turns. We only ever got through 2 because the first time through, everything failed on turn 1. We had to recock the game. We got through 2 turns. Everybody was comfortable with what we did. Okay, back to my pathologies here because I'm running a little long on time. Lack of preparation, I think it's pretty obvious. Poor red cell. I talked a little bit about this, but I need a red cell who can give me useful information on what's wrong with our COA. So it's often not so much about trying to second guess and beat somebody, but determining where are the problems and appropriately poking at them so that the planning team has to resolve them, has to go back and fix those holes. Choosing the wrong events. Hey, if the hardest part of my plan is executing a Neo and I don't wargame it at all, I wargame something else, then I've overlooked an opportunity that's rife with potential problems. So again, we need to choose the right events to make sure we're actually wargaming the place with the most friction, most difficulty, or the areas that we are least confident will be successful. And the other one we see a lot is people will evaluate the course of action during the war game. That's not where you evaluate it. You evaluate it in the next step, comparison decision, or comparison depending on which planning process you're using. I don't need to. I don't want to evaluate it while I'm wargaming. So pitfalls after the war game. This is a big one I see, is assuming a script. Okay, we just ran the war game, and people then assume, now I know what the enemy's going to do. Well, the enemy wasn't actually at our war game, so you don't know what they're going to do. You just know some things that they might do that could potentially cause you problems. So there is no script still. I have to account for all the ways my adversary could potentially apply their capabilities. So we haven't come up with a script, and got to make sure you don't convince yourself you have. Another one is discounting the results. And I see this a lot where something happens in a game we don't like, and we just say, that's just a war game. We can ignore that. It's there for a reason. If you don't respond to it, then you're missing an opportunity and potentially putting people's lives at risk. Overreacting to Red's actions. Hey, sometimes I don't need to react, right? If I've already accounted for something Red can do and then they do it, I've already accounted for. I don't need to react to that. And there's some things red might do that maybe I don't need to rework my whole COA around this one thing that red might do, but maybe I need to put some ISR on it to give me some tippers that they might be moving that direction, or maybe rework some force allocation, but I don't need to write a whole new COA on it. And this is another one that I'll see a lot is, well, find a problem in a war game and only fix it in one COA and not the rest of them. If the problem persists that you uncover, fix it across the board, because any one of those COAs might get executed, and you want to give yourself the best chances for success. So you got to go through and fix it everywhere. Okay, wrap up, and then I'll get the rest of the questions here in the time that's left allotted to me. Just some key points. Preparation and organization are critical. I got to make sure everybody understands my course of action. They're properly organized to look at the problem so we can actually get a successful war game. Wargaming is being done to improve my course of action. And that's what I want to get out of it. It's not about winning and losing. It's not about seeing who's the smartest. It's about improving the course of action we put forward. And that's everybody's focus should be on, how do we make a course of action that's most likely to be successful? You have to go through and wargame all your valid COAs. If I don't wargame the COA, I can't take it forward into comparison decision because I haven't done analysis on it. I don't know enough about it. So if it's a valid COA, I got to wargame it. And anything that comes out of it needs to immediately affect my course of action. So whatever we learned in that game immediately needs to feed back into the course of action and make those changes so that we can have an effective war game. Okay, that was my last slide. So I got about 8 minutes to take more questions. What level of warfare does a commander have time to wargame a COA? So I would say at all levels. But it depends on what level you're at, depends on how much you can do it. You can do this all the way down at a fire team level where you just do a quick, here's what I'm going to do, here's what I'm going to do, here's what I'm going to do. What do we think the enemy might do? Talk about it real quick, maybe make some tweaks and adjustments and move forward. As you go up in level, those games get a little bit more complicated. More things are happening. More people need to be addressed. But you got to do it at if you're doing planning, I'm writing an order, I'm doing a planning process, I have to do some type of war game. The war games don't have to be complicated. I don't have to bring in 100 plus people to run it. I can do it around a table with a half dozen folks who are understand the course of action, understand the adversary. So you really at any level you're doing planning, you need to be able to do that the war game. So hopefully that answered the question. Time constrained. Yeah, could you choose one COA early? Maybe. And sometimes you do when one is obviously better than the others. And we just jump on it and we're just going to war game one COA. And that's fine. I've done that. I've written plans and done exercises where we only developed that one COA because it's really all we had that was feasible, that was valid. So if it's all you got, then yeah, you use the war game to improve it. You still do the war game. You just now I'm looking at how can I make my course of action better. So how would it affect my method? Well, it may give me more time to do a war game if only war game one COA. So maybe I can do a little bit more. But I'm still going to look at the method the same way. What's the appropriate approach? Do I want to do computer aided? I want to do manual. And when I look at a box, do I want to look at an avenue in depth? Do I want to look at a sequence of essential tasks? I don't think that would be affected by how many COAs I'm doing. It's just now I know I have more time available to me potentially because I'm only looking at one course of action. All right, next. So how is it different from a rehearsal? So a rehearsal is, doctrinally speaking, a rehearsal is a type of transition where I go from people who have written the plan to people who are going to execute the plan. Generally, rehearsals are not just big war games. They tend to be more about the details of the execution and less about whether or not the plan was written correctly. Yes, you do learn things in rehearsals. We will occasionally uncover things that are problematic and that need to be adjusted. It's a little bit different from the war game because it's not. It's meant to be done after a COA has been chosen, after it's been developed into a con-op, and after an order has been produced. Whether it's finalized or not can kind of depend on where you are and what your situation is. Normally, we think of rehearsal as a type of transition as opposed to a war game. But yeah, you can still learn stuff during a rehearsal. Does giving friendlies 2 decision points, enemies 1, assume asymmetric capabilities of command and control? I don't think so. I don't think that's not the purpose of it. And I see where you might come to that conclusion, but that's not the purpose. The purpose of the counteraction, that second decision point for the friendly, is to fix what we did the first time. So friendly goes out. Here's what we think we're going to do. An enemy takes their action. Oh, whew, what we did was bad. Let's go back and fix it. And that's what the counteraction's for, is to fix what we did, make changes, make adjustments to our course of action to account for what the enemy might do in that situation. So don't think of it as we're assuming that we have a better command and control, therefore we get to move twice. That's not the genesis of that. It's that opportunity, because again, why are we doing this? To come up with a better course of action, and that's an opportunity just to tweak our course of action. Sometimes if the change is dramatic enough, you'll run the turn again. Like the war game I talked about earlier where we failed on turn one. We got to run the game again. I can't just take a counteraction and go from catastrophic failure and call it success. We got to do it again. So sometimes you will do that if you have to make a big enough change during your counteraction. And that's up to the OPT leader how they want to handle that. We COA game against an ECO in order to prove our COA. That depends on the quality of the ECOA. Yeah, so ideally, what you would want is a red. So, perfect world. When I stand up my OPT to begin planning my blue actions, I have a red cell stands with the red OPT. They take the ECOA they've been given and they start developing that out into almost a full plan. Maybe not level of detail, but they start improving it and developing and going through all those things. So when we get to the war game, they have a better developed product than that initial ECOA. So yes, it does depend on how good that ECOA is. One of the reasons that we use an ECOA is to make sure that we're all consistent on what we're planning against. If I'm the maritime component and I'm planning against a different enemy course of action than the land component is, our plans get desynced very quickly. So that's why we do it that way. But yeah, that's a good point. A bad ECOA tends us towards a plan that's less effective. Yeah, and that's something we need to just be aware of and hope our red cell can help keep us straight. I saw another one pop in there that I didn't get a chance to read. You skip the war game step. Yeah, and that's kind of goes in line with the rehearsal question. If we haven't done the war game, then the rehearsal will become a war game because we haven't done a war game. We don't really know if things work or not. So you want to make sure you're doing that co-analysis step to sort all that stuff out before we go to rehearsal. Let the planning team fix those problems so the executors don't have to. They can focus on appropriate execution. Yeah, that's a great comment. If we had any more questions, I got about a minute or so left. How much capacity for intentional deception ops by red cells acceptable? So this is another it depends. So it depends on what level you're looking at. And so if I'm looking kind of that operational high tactical level, then intentional deception by red cell probably is something we should be looking at. That they may be intentionally running a deception. And what we're really looking at then is how would we determine what the real action is? And this becomes that hey, where do I want to position forces to account for a deception versus a real action? Because again, I can't, just because my red cell came up with a really good deception plan, doesn't mean it's not the actual activities that the enemy is going to do, and we just thought it was a deception. So I have to account for that two ways. All right, what else might they be doing, and what if this really is the enemy's actions? And so you got to build your COA to be able to account for both of those places. Lower tactical levels, deception actually is a little bit easier to gain, just because it's smaller in scope and scale, and something you can then account for a little bit easier. You often have less time to work through it, though. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of capacity for intentional deception, especially for a well-developed enemy and a well-developed problem. Yes, you can publish my email. I think it was on my first slide. I can go back to it while we're here. A little bit of time I have left, if anybody's still on. I believe my work email is on there. Here we go. No, it's just my phone number. Don't call my phone number anytime soon because I'm not in my office. But yeah, that is my email. You can feel free to contact me there if you have questions or follow-ups that we didn't get to here. Unfortunately, I'm not on the Discord because I'm at work, so I can't get on the Discord server, but I can answer email. So I see the question from Zoltan. Yeah, red can have multiple actions as a response. Don't think the reaction is a single thing. It could be a laundry list of potential things. You want to keep it reasonable so you can respond, but they may provide a whole bunch of things. The issue is once we give our counteraction, red's not going to go back and come up, well, if you do that, this is what I'm going to do. We really want to give us the right out of the gate what we think they're going to be doing so we can write a course of action to respond to it. Okay. So that was the last question.